you have the ego in the schizophrenic that's being disrupted by processes underneath, fantasies and that sort of thing, and that looks like it's reflected in involuntary eye movements, like dream movements. So anyways, so much for the crazy hyena, and they're in real trouble. Now the king's eye, who's supposed to be keeping an eye on this and was supposed to be watching Simba, is trying to intervene, but I mean, look at him. He's like a delicious little bird, and so that's not working out very well. Anyways, and then you see this immediate juxtaposition of the domain of death and the hyenas with hell, right? And everyone looks at that and they think, well, they know exactly what that means. It's no surprise to anyone that that happens. And I suppose that's partly because on the veldt, where we evolved in large part, but not by no means all part, fire was an ever-present danger in the grasslands, right? And so that's a good example of hell. So, well, I guess that's it. We'll do some more of this when we meet on Tuesday. Bye.
Let's see what is happening today, what we're gonna do today. Okay, I have arrived right at the reset time. Let's do some still 6 level 7, 8 disproportional against 6. No, not enough quest for those 2 motherfuckers. Exploration done a little bit 15 minutes ago. Okay. Okay, so I can do this. Current level up, I need this one. Get some bombs. Let's go kill some zombies. Let's go to the other side. They are incoming. Let's do daily bullshit. Damn. Where the fuck are you leave going? Let's go see how much died, guys. Yes, please. Oh, nice. Get some daily quests. Where the fuck are you? Inside. No, outside. Okay, let's... shop. Daily bullshit. Weekly bullshit. Tuesday brought everything. Diamond, no. Trinity. Weekly. Brought. Monthly. Silver bar, monthly. What the fuck? Okay, next. Monthly bullshit. Let's go skills.
So we'll continue with our Jungian analysis of the Lion King today. We ended at the point where, remember, Mufasa
bullshit.
had taken Simba up to the top of Pride Rock and
Why the fuck are you dropping them these?
described to him the fact that his kingdom essentially constituted everything that the light touched. And you can think about that as the domain of
Okay, let's go
roughly speaking, of the Great Father, with the domain of the Great Mother on the outside of that being symbolically equivalent to the underworld or to death or to nature. All of those things seem to be approximately equally true.
Plans.
And he forbade Simba from going to investigate what was beyond the confines of the light. And in some sense, that's exactly what a tradition does for you, because the tradition is precisely what defines the domain of the light. And to be moral from the perspective of the tradition, it's akin to playing a Piagetian game, but only adhering to the rules. You know how Piaget described the fact that when kids first master a game, they learn how to act it out, and then they learn what the rules are, and then they regard the rules in some sense as sacred. You can't go outside the rules. And then later in moral development, if they get to that stage, then they start to recognize themselves also as formulators of the rule or formulators of the game.
After new season,
and culture tells you don't go beyond the rules. That's the definition of morality within the box of culture.
50,
you don't go outside of that.
Extra
and so that's why Mufasa plays that particular role. And it's wise because if you go outside the domain of what you already understand, then it's dangerous out there.
Fails.
Clearly, it's dangerous out there. But
Season
the downside of that particular message,
40.
and this is the mythological reason why Mufasa isn't as aware as he could be of Scar. You know, his knowledge is bounded, and he's not aware enough of what lies outside of that in this realm, let's say, of death and destruction. And so Scar is able to overcome his brother. You see this sort of thing happening to people very frequently, for example, who develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the things that's not as well known about post-traumatic stress disorder as might be known is, A, it happens to you if you encounter an experience that sort of blows out the axioms of your knowledge system. That's one way of looking at it. It's so unexpected that you can't account for it within the confines of the system that you're using to interpret the world.
Say it.
And that often happens to people when they encounter something that's truly malevolent. And that can be within them, or it can be in the form of someone else who is genuinely out to hurt them. They're often, people who develop PTSD are often, but not always, somewhat naive, and they're not aware of the full catastrophe of the world. That might be one way of looking at it. And then they encounter someone who's
take your time,
truly out to hurt them. And they can detect that even in the way the person's face looks, or they encounter a part of them that's much more malevolent than they had ever imagined it could possibly be. And then they do something terrible, and then they don't know what to do about it. So Dallaire, the Canadian general, wrote a book called Shake Hands with the Devil, and it was about what happened to him in Rwanda when he was stationed there as a UN warrior or a UN soldier. And I mean, Dallaire was not naive, but what he encountered was truly malevolent, and it just blew him into pieces, and that's what happens. And so there's real utility in staying within the bounded domain, but the problem is that there may be information that's outside of that domain that you absolutely need to know. And so part of the problem with being alive is that you have to continually determine how much you're going to maintain your stability and how much you're going to explore. And you have to explore because the stable part of you gets outdated. But if you explore too much or too unwisely, then you can encounter things that flip you upside down. It's actually one of the problems with being high in trait openness, especially if you're also high in neuroticism. Because if you're open, you're creative, you're always looking for ideas that are outside of your current systematic way of thinking. But if you're high in neuroticism, so you experience a lot of anxiety and emotional pain and that sort of thing, you can continually upset your own apple cart. Now, the other thing that you might want to think about, this is really useful as far as I'm concerned, is you might want to think about this politically. And we've been doing a lot of work. I'm going to have one of my graduate students actually come and talk to you about the work we've been doing on personality and political belief. So what happens with political belief is that if you're high in openness and low in conscientiousness, you tend to be a liberal, the openness being the particularly important part of that. And if you're low in openness and high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, you tend to be a conservative. Now, it's kind of strange because openness and conscientiousness aren't very highly correlated. So it's not obvious why those two traits would combine to determine political belief, and the relationship is actually quite strong between temperament and political belief if you measure political belief comprehensively. But it seems to me that the fundamental distinction, and this is the political game at least along the liberal conservative axis, boils down to one thing. It boils down to how open borders should be compared to how closed they should be. And you know, you can see that reflected, for example, in the attractiveness of Trump to a large part of the general population, because he's going to close the borders, build a wall, and fortify the borders. And conservatives like that. They like to have borders between things stay tight. And they don't even care if it's state borders, or political borders, or town borders, or ethnic borders, or borders between ideas, or borders between sexual identities. Conservatives like to have things stay in the damn box where they belong. Partly because they're orderly, and partly because they're low in openness. They don't get any real, they're not interested in what happens if you free up your conceptions. All they see in that is the probability of disorder. Whereas liberals, who are high in openness and low in conscientiousness / orderliness, they get a real charge out of letting things out of the box so that they can creatively interplay. Now the issue is, who's correct? And the answer is, you don't know. Because the environment underneath the political landscape moves. And so sometimes the right answer is tighten up the borders and fortify. And sometimes the right answer is no, loosen things up because everything's getting too static and tight and we need more information. And the dialogue that occurs in the political landscape, this is why dialogue is so important, is fundamentally between these two opposing views of borders. And because you can't say with certainty which one is right at any given time, an open dialogue has to maintain itself so that the entire political state can maneuver properly along that moving line. It's absolutely crucial. It's really, really, really useful to know that people vote their damn temperament. It gives you more of an understanding, at least in principle, of those who sit on the other side of you on the political fence. And there's been recent newspaper articles, quite interesting. I tweeted a couple of them about this company in UK called Cambridge Analytics, and they're using the damn Big Five. They can extract out Big Five information from your Facebook likes. They've got a model of every single person in the United States Big Five personality, and they help Trump craft political messages right down to the level of apartment buildings to appeal to people based on their Big Five temperament. And that's all recent work. And so one of the things that's very interesting is we are teaching computers to understand us so fast you can't believe it. And we really do risk walking into an electronic world where you will only see what you want to see. I mean, obviously the marketers are trying to do that as fast as possible, right? They only want to send you ads that you're going to be interested in because it's expensive and foolish to send you anything that will annoy you or that you'll ignore. And so the marketers are trying like mad to map who you are, even by watching your eyes.
Yes, please.
They're trying to figure out who you are so they can send you the right information. But the danger is that that'll happen, say, in the domain of news and broader information, increasing this tendency for people to be siloed in their exposure to the external world. It's sort of like each of us is becoming a micro-celebrity surrounded by electronic sycophants who do nothing but tell us exactly what we want to hear. It's a real problem. Karl Popper, a famous philosopher of science, said that one of the things that you should do, and this is the Hegelian view, is you should always look for information that contradicts your current viewpoint. Now that's painful, right? Because your axioms contradicted. It can take you apart. But it's the only way that you can ensure that you're learning at the same time that you're maintaining your stability. And that's another reason why it's really necessary to engage in dialogue with people that you don't agree with. Because they're the ones who will tell you things that you don't know. It's of crucial importance in the maintenance of your own stability. The worst thing that can happen to a person, because there's many horrible things that can happen to a person. But one of the worst things that can happen is that you find yourself in a situation where no one is offering you corrective feedback anymore. Because you rely on the corrective feedback provided by other people to keep yourself sane, keep moving in the ever-changing environment. If you cut yourself off from that feedback, then you end up static and shrinking. It's really not good. You get less and less competent, you get less and less confident, and the threats outside of you loom larger and larger. So that's all to do with the domain outside the light. See, Jung would also say that out in this domain that's sort of beyond what you understand, that's also where you encounter the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Now that's a really, really complicated idea. But what he means by that is that if you're put outside the domain of your competence, you're going to start to use fantasy to organize your world. So I can give you an example of that. So most of you are old enough to have a conscious memory of when the Twin Towers came crashing down. And so everybody in the days after that was wandering around like they were in a daze. And the reason they were in a daze is because, well, it wasn't exactly clear what fell, right? There was the physical towers fell, but that was only a tiny bit of the problem because those physical towers were embedded in a network of meaning, like a very, very sophisticated network of meaning, but also a political network and an economic network and a military network, and like they're nodes inside a very complex system. So when they come crashing down, you don't know what's come crashing down, right? So you're out there in the unknown and wondering what's going on and wandering around in a daze, which is exactly what happened to people. And then what Bush did, George W., was immediately turn that into a good versus evil drama instantly. And that's an archetypal idea. So that's when he came up with the idea of the axis of evil. I think that was Iran, North Korea, and I don't remember the other one at the moment. But he immediately turned the political landscape into a good versus evil drama. And he said to everyone in the world that they were either with him or against him, fundamentally. And that was part of the retreating into, I guess, a more protected landscape. That's one of the ways that human beings deal with the encounter with a traumatic threat. And so the reason you meet the unconscious and even the collective unconscious on the border of your knowledge is because when you hit the border of your knowledge, you start to use fantasy in order to bring the newest form of order out of the unknown so that you can start to make sense out of it. And that's what artists always do. That's what they do. And so from the Jungian perspective, people who are engaged in creative art are the ones who are on the perimeter of knowledge structures. And so what they're doing is taking the absolute unknown, which would be, in Rumsfeld's terms, the unknown unknowns, and turning them into partially known unknowns. That's what an artist does. And especially the more classical artists who deal with mythological and religious themes, which was the case for art right up until the late 20th century. They're using these mythological ideas to sort of extend the domain of human knowledge out beyond its current parameters.
Level 40.
And so artists do that, and literary people do that, and dramatists do that, and they help us extend our knowledge. Now, that's where open people live. That's another way of thinking about it. So think about it this way. So you're in a city, and the city has parts of it that degenerate. And so you could think about that as order degenerating into chaos. And then the open people who are creative come along and they find places in the city that have degenerated but that still have interesting potential, right? And then they move in there where it's cheap too, and they start producing art. They start producing galleries, and then the coffee shops move in, and then the thing starts to get civilized. And then, of course, the more liberal conservative types move in. Those would be the yuppies, roughly speaking. So they're much more conservative than the artists, but they're still liberal compared to the bulk of the population. And so the more daring people move in after the artists have civilized it. And then after that, then the chain stores start to move in, and soon it's completely turned into Zellers or something like that. And then the artists have to go somewhere else and find another place on the boundary where they can live, and it's a physical boundary as much as a mental boundary. And so because you think each of those personality traits, there's 5 dimensions, each of them represent the possibility of inhabiting a kind of niche, right? An ecological niche. So if you're an extroverted person, your niche is the social environment. If you're an introverted person, the niche is, I think, nature. I don't know that for sure, because I've never figured out exactly what introverts are adapted to, but it's not exactly the social world. If you're agreeable, then your niche is relationships. If you're disagreeable, your niche is competition. If you're conscientious, your niche is duty and effort. And so, those niches are partly social because so much of our environment is social, but they're also partly natural because our social being is nested inside the natural world. And so you can think about the big 5 traits as different kinds of adaptations to different kinds of niches. And that's the niche that the open people
get back everything.
The open exploratory types occupy. So that seems to make a higher order super factor, extroversion and openness, called plasticity, as opposed to stability, which is conscientiousness, agreeableness, and emotional stability. And there's a playoff between those two things, because the stable people obviously are stable, but the plastic types of people are more dynamic, and they're more concerned with transformation. And in order to get a system optimally stable and dynamic, you have to have a continual interplay of those factors. Because static doesn't work, because everything changes. That's the problem with conservatism. And the problem with liberalism fundamentally is, yes, everything changes, but you have to bring forward some structures from the past. So it's very, very difficult to get that balance correct.
Journal. So, okay, let me see.
All right, so anyways, out there in the underworld, in the place beyond your current conceptualizations, that's the place of death and nature, and it's beyond the light, and it's also the place of hell, and that's what you see here. And how do you conceptualize that? Well, one of the things you'll see, if you're interested in this sort of thing, if you ever go read the writings of the Columbine killers, the teens, they're very interesting. They're very much worth reading, especially I think it's Dylan Klebold, who was the more literate of the two. But he tells you exactly where he went after brooding and brooding on his isolation and segregation from mankind. So he's out there beyond, he's out there in a chaotic domain, and because he's tortured by that, his thoughts take an unbelievably dark turn. Like, it's unimaginably dark. If you're interested in that sort of thing, you could read that. There's another book you could read called Panzram, P-A-N-Z-R-A-M, and it's a fascinating book. It's about this guy who, I think he raped 1,200 men. So that sort of tells you what sort of guy he was. Extraordinarily physically powerful and brutal and malevolent, and he was kind of a juvenile delinquent type, and they put him in a reform school, and he was not well treated in that reform school. It's sort of like the worst of the Canadian residential schools. And when he came out, he was not a happy boy. And so he spent the rest of his life trying to be as destructive as he could possibly imagine, and purely, consciously, with malevolent intent. And then, and believe me, he was pretty destructive. He kept track of the dollar value of all the buildings he burned down. He tried to start a war between Britain and the United States. Like, he was all out for all-out mayhem. His dying words, that they're going to hang him, he told the guy who was going to hang him, he said, "Hurry up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 12 men in the time it takes you to hang me." And that's exactly the sort of person he was. And he made friends with this physician in the prison, who he thought was like the first person who ever did something nice for him, gave him $1 for cigarettes, if I remember correctly, and the physician encouraged him to write his autobiography. And so he did, and it's available. And so if you want a view, because, you know, you always think of people, you think, well, people have good intentions, you know, that you especially think that if you're naive and agreeable.
Oh my God,
so all of you who are sitting there out there thinking people have good intentions, you're probably high in agreeableness. But that's not always the case.
Okay.
People can have very dark motivations that are fully conscious and very well elaborated. And Panzram was he was smart. And his book is very well written, and he tells you exactly why he thought the way he thought. And so it's a good glimpse of exactly this sort of thing, where you can get to, if you want to, by brooding on your specific misfortune. You know, and his basic credo was that human beings were so reprehensible that they should just be eliminated. And believe me, that's what he was trying to do. And these people who do terrible things, like the Columbine shooters, that's exactly what, for lack of a better word, they're possessed by. It's sheer malevolence. And the Columbine kids had a much more spectacular catastrophe planned than the one that actually occurred. And they knew it was going to be a full-blown media circus. And lots of these people who engage in those sorts of mass murders, they know about the other mass murderers, and they're engaged in a competition. And the competition is who can do the most brutal thing the fastest, something like that. So you can't just be thinking about people who have good intentions but have somehow gone wrong. If you ever meet someone who isn't like that and you think that, you're just a tree with ripe fruit to be plucked. So you don't want to be in that situation. You have to keep your eyes open. And so anyways, that's basically what's encapsulated in this part of the story. Now, the hyenas go after the little lion, obviously, but they manage to escape. It's a very malevolent scene. And Mufasa shows up at the last minute to rescue them. So, and you know, that there's also a mythological trope there, which is that if you go outside your domain of competence and you encounter something you don't understand, the first thing that you're going to do is look to the knowledge structures that you already possess to explain it, right? And that's you could say from a symbolic perspective that that's the manifestation of the Father, because of course that's what you're going to do. And you know what's really interesting too is because I've had a lot of clients who've had PTSD, and without exception every single one of them was induced by one form of malevolence or another. They have to develop a very sophisticated philosophy of good and evil to get out of it, because they have a worldview in which those things don't really exist. There's no such thing as pure malevolence. Well, that's fine unless you encounter it, and then as soon as you encounter it, you won't know what to do. And then you won't be able to get on with your life. You'll do nothing but think about that and think about it and think about it and think about it. It'll disrupt your sleep. It'll put you into a permanent state of preparation for action. Because the part of your brain that's detected that, which in my estimation, by the way, is the same part, at least in part, that detects snakes. It's the same damn circuit. Once it's seen something like that, it is not going to let you go till you figure it out. And that's basically what post-traumatic stress disorder is. And you know, to some degree, each of you will have experienced that, maybe not all of you in here, but many of you. And you can tell that. So if you go back and you think about your past, and you have any memory that's more than about 18 months old, and when you think about it, it produces a fair bit of negative emotion, then that's like a place where there's a mini post-traumatic stress problem. And what's happened? You remember I showed you that hierarchy? Moving from tiny motor actions all the way up to high order abstractions. Well, you can imagine, say, you have good person at the top, and you kind of use that scenario to construe other people. People are basically good. Well, then you run into someone who is not good, and boom, the whole bloody system comes tumbling down because it's violated that highest order axiom. So that's post-traumatic stress disorder. If something has violated an axiom that's more differentiated, you know, closer to the actual motor output, not quite so high in the abstraction chain, then all it does is wipe out that part of the structure. It doesn't wipe out the whole thing. And you can tell if you have holes in your perceptual value structure by checking to see if you have memories that are still alive in a negative way that are old enough so that they should have been incorporated into your personality. And so one of the things you can do,
no one doesn't want to buy.
You're doing one of the exercises that's on my self-authoring site. You guys do the personality analysis, but there's another program there called the it's called the past authoring, where you write down an autobiography. And thinking through these things that have happened to you in your past that are negative is a good way of making them go away. And thinking them through kind of means you have to figure out what happened, right? And then you sort of have to figure out how to make it not happen again. What you're trying to derive is some kind of causal analysis. How is it that I was put into a situation where I was made vulnerable? You know, and that could be, well, because you're only 4 and you couldn't protect yourself, and now it's time to update that because you're a fully functioning adult. Or there may be things that you have to think through and change in your own personality, or attitudes that you've been holding on to since you were tiny. I had this client once, and she came in and told me that she had been sexually assaulted by her older brother. And she told me the story, and I kind of got the impression that maybe she was like 8 and he was like 17 or something like that. And she was about 27 when she came and talked to me. And then I found out by further questioning that she was 4 and he was 6. And I thought, she still had this story in her head of her being tormented by this older person, right? That's how she told the story. And what I told her was, well, look, another way of looking at this is that you two were very badly supervised children. Because, I mean, he was 6, for God's sake. You know, he's a little kid. That doesn't mean that what happened to her was any less traumatic. But he wasn't 17, right? The story was different than the one she had in her head. And, you know, by the time she left, after we had that conversation, it was clear that the way that she was construing the experience had radically shifted. And it was very interesting because, you know, you think of the past as fixed. And it is in some sense, but the reason you remember the past isn't to make an objectively accurate record of the past. It's so that you can use the information in the past to prepare you for the future. And your mind won't leave you alone unless that has happened. So if you've encountered something that's negative and you don't know why and you don't know what to do about it if that happens again in the future, then that will stay with you. And I think one of the things it does too is it increases your overall physiological load. There's actually physiologists who've been talking about this
350.
I can't remember the damn phrase, but you can imagine that your mind is doing something like this all the time. It's
very nice.
it's got a record in some sense of your autobiographical experiences. And what it's doing is calculating how frequently you've been successful versus unsuccessful. And the more frequently that you've been successful, the higher you are up on the dominance hierarchy. That's one possibility. So your serotonin levels go up and you're calmer. But also, it's reasonable to assume that the environment is less dangerous, right? Because that's sort of what constitutes danger. You're somewhere and you act and something you don't want to have happen happens. That's danger. And so your brain is always trying to figure out how to calibrate how anxious you should be. And one of the things it does is by sort of keeping track of your past success-failure ratio. And so, to the degree that your past has been characterized by, we'll call them failures, those are situations where you do not get what you want, then your brain puts your body on constant alert. Because if everything that you've done has resulted in catastrophe, then you're somewhere insanely dangerous, and you should be like a prey animal that's ready to dart in any direction. And how much you should be a prey animal is dependent on, it's an estimate, partly your trait neuroticism, partly your success as adjudicated by other people, right? Because they'll pop you up the dominance hierarchy if you've been successful, but also partly on your record of failures and successes in the past. And so you can go back and you can find out where you have holes in the structure through which you're viewing the world. That's one way of looking at it. And you can sew those things up. And that's in some sense, that's what you're doing in psychotherapy. You know, partly it's exposure to things you're afraid of and disgusted by and are likely to avoid. That's a huge chunk of it. But if you go back into your past and you start talking those things through, it's really the same thing. It's more abstract.
What did I say?
So Freud, of course, was always, when he was doing his free association process with his clients, he'd find that if he just let them talk, that their speech would circle until it hit a place like that, where they were confused and doubtful. And then their speech would sort of wander around that, and then they'd have an emotional expression. That was a consequence of that. He thought the emotional expression was what was curative. It was cathartic in his terms. But later, James Pennebaker, upon whom these writing exercises I described, his research is based on that. My exercises are based on his research. He found that if you brought college students into the lab and you had them write for 15 minutes 3 times over 3 days about the worst thing that had ever happened to them, or the worst thing they ever did, if I remember correctly, they got worse in the short term but better in the long run. For example, they went and visited the doctor less, and markers of their physical health improved. And so I think the reason for that is because
double clicking.
What is that called? It's called something load. Just about got it right from the physiologist. Doesn't matter. So they got healthier as far as I can tell because they basically calmed down. Once they had gone through the negative memory and sorted it out properly and told a properly articulated story and figured out how to deal with it, then their physiology calmed down. And so then they weren't as stressed, they weren't producing as much cortisol, and so cortisol suppresses your immune function, and so they were more likely to stay healthy.
This one?
And so
I don't need anymore, anyone.
That's all very much worth thinking about. That's all in the domain outside of the light. That's one way of thinking about it.
Let's see.
Now, of course,
one more time.
Simba and what's the girl's name?
Bags.
Mala, yeah. They're, pretty cowed about what has happened, because they sort of stumbled stupidly out into the unknown. They stumbled foolishly out into the unknown. And this actually highlights another Jungian archetype, and that's the archetype of the trickster. And the trickster is like the Joker in the king's court. And the trickster is someone who will be or play the fool. And the thing about the fool is that the fool is close to the truth, because you can't learn anything new unless you're willing to be a fool. Right? You know what that's like. You know exactly what that's like. You have to master a new skill, but you're avoiding it because you know that you'll be bad at it when you first do it. And if you're perfectionistic, you're going to say, well, I can't allow myself to be bad at anything. I can't allow myself to be a fool. And no wonder. But the problem is when you try something new, you're always a fool. And so unless you're willing to be a fool, you can't learn anything new. And that's also why Jung regarded the trickster as the precursor to the savior, archetypally speaking, is because you cannot do the right thing unless you're willing to be a fool first. And that's really worth knowing. Lots of times, you guys are going to make a stage transition in your life, and you're going to feel like an imposter. when you get a new job or when you get a promotion or something like that, you're going to feel like an imposter.
Bang.
And you are. Because what do you know when you make that first transition, right? But it's going to make you embarrassed and it's going to make you ashamed and all of those things. But you have to understand that you are a fool when you first try something new. But you're a worse fool if you don't try it. Now, that doesn't mean you should, make like you know everything as soon as you're promoted or you have some transition in status. That's foolish, of the wrong sort. But to know that you have to be fallible in order to progress is an unbelievably useful thing. It can free you up. I was talking to a writer the other day about his process for beginning writing. He's written many books. He writes a very, very, very bad first draft.
So
right, and that's a good way to think about things, is throughout your life you're going to be doing that, is writing the next draft of you, and it's pretty bad to begin with. But that's okay, because it isn't going to get any better unless you put yourself out into the domain of the unknown to begin with. And it might go badly. I mean, that's what happens here. Anyways, Mufasa has a chat with Simba and, tells him that he did what he wasn't supposed to do. Although, even in that situation, Mufasa's discipline is paradoxical, because there's part of him, because he's reasonably wise, that knows that breaking the rules like that is actually necessary. Even though you still have to say, play by the damn rules. You have to leave that door open so that the rules can be broken at appropriate amount. So he forgives him, and peace is made between them, and then they involve themselves in sort of gazing at the night sky. So the two of them do that together. And the night sky is an interesting place, because that's where the absolute unknown resides. And one of the things Jung wrote a lot about was astrology, strangely enough, / astronomy. And one of Jung's contentions, this is a very interesting one, was that because the night sky was completely unknown, people could project their fantasies into it. And that's what they did with astrology. So astrology is this cumulative fantasy that's going on in the roughly speaking, in the deep unconscious, projected onto the sky. And so if you analyze old astrological writings, what you're really doing is analyzing old fantasies, and because of that you could develop some insight into the structure of the mind. And so he did the same thing with alchemy in his later writings, which are very, very difficult to understand, but extremely worthwhile. Okay, so anyways, back to the hellish domain. Now, I told you that domain that's outside of knowledge, you can think about that as the underworld, or you can think about it as nature, the negative element of nature in particular.
Why the fuck is
I mentioned that one element of that is hellish, and that's exactly what the movie explains next. It does exactly that. We go back out to this domain that Scar, the adversary, or the negative king, that's another way of looking at him. This is the domain over which he rules. And so you can see him there surrounded by fire. Same idea as the as the hyenas surrounded by fire earlier, although this is green fire and smoke, which I think is even worse. And this is where the movie starts to draw on essentially Nazi symbolism, at least the symbolism of totalitarian states. And,
yes, please.
You think about a totalitarian state, you think about the Nazis and their goose stepping, and what's happening is that every single person in the military becomes an identical unit, right? They're all uniform, and they're all, in some sense, imitating the dictator in an absolutely perfect way. And so the dictator wants to impose strict uniformity on the entire population. That's order. And one of the things we've discovered that's really interesting is that disgust sensitivity is associated with orderliness, and that's associated with conscientiousness. And one of the things about Hitler was that he was very disgust sensitive, and a lot of his hatred for non-Aryans. So imagine inside the Aryan box, it was all uniform. Outside, it was all parasites and predators. And that was a manifestation of disgust, not of fear. It's a whole different thing. And if you read Hitler's Table Talk, which is a collection of his spontaneous dinner speeches from 1939 to 1942, it's a very interesting book. You see that his metaphor for the Aryan race was a body, a pure body, unassaulted by parasites or predators, and that he was trying to erect a border around it to keep all of that away. So it's an immunological disgust-like metaphor. And there's some recent work that was published in PLOS One about 3 years ago showing that brilliant study, should have
Again,
got much more
gold
attention,
bone
showing
pants,
that if
casual
you went
jogging
around
pants,
and sampled
basic
political
cargo
attitudes in
pants,
different
metal
countries,
washed pants,
or even
plus
within the
5
same
cowboy
country,
pants. I
what
think
you
we have
found was
metal
that
washed,
the higher the
dual
prevalence of
tone,
infectious diseases,
casual jogger,
the higher the
metal
probability
washed.
of totalitarian political attitudes at the local level. And you can imagine, well, what happens if there's infectious diseases is you want to put borders around everything. You don't want free movement between ideas or people, because that's partly how the disease spreads. You're going to have much more strict
don't have
sexual
anything.
rules, for example, because that's a great way for diseases to be
Metal
transmitted.
washed,
And before Hitler went
Western
on his
pants,
rampage
Slovak
against
leggings,
the
Russian
non-Aryans,
pants,
he
straight
cleaned up all
denim,
the factories.
vintage cotton,
Like he went in there and
military
fumigated them.
pants,
It was part of the law. And he
Western
went
denim
on a
pants,
public health campaign to
zookeeper pants,
get rid of
wash and fit
tuberculosis, and he
pants.
got rid of the bugs in the factories as well. He used Zyklon B. That's an insecticide, and that's the gas that he used in the gas chambers eventually. So first it was the bugs in the rats, and then it was people who were, then it was euthanasia. That was the next move, and forced euthanasia. And the rationale for that was
Alrighty then.
compassion, by the way, just so you all know.
Let's see this.
It's merciful to put these people who
Russia
are
bandit shot
burdensome to themselves and their families and the state,
Zookeeper
who are
pants,
living
5.
second-rate lives. It's merciful to euthanize them.
bandit
And that
shot
was a huge campaign
5.
in Germany. It was after that that the more
Zookeeper 5
racial
plus 5.
purifications
Let's
began.
go plus 5.
So that's the disgust thing. That's unbelievably important.
Let's go plus 5.
It's
Prepare
because
for
lots
the
of
next
times
round.
people think that conservatives are more anxiety sensitive than liberals, and that's why they're
Whatever the
closed
fuck
in terms of their ideas. That doesn't look right. First of all, conservatives are less neurotic than liberals, although the effect isn't that big. So it doesn't look, and they actually are, they score higher in measures of well-being. The
Let's
most
go.
unhappy
Plus
people are
5.
liberal men, by the way. So, but you know, people are often accused, if they're conservative, of being fearful, and that's why they, you know,
Zookeeper,
suppress other
cargo,
people's
roll-up,
viewpoints. But that doesn't
construction
look right.
cargo,
It's low
straight denim
openness
pants,
and high
vintage
orderliness, and that
cotton
looks like it's
pants,
associated with disgust, and that looks like it's
vintage cotton
associated with
pants,
something
plus
called the
5.
extended immune system, which is the proclivity of people
Yes, 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 yes.
to keep themselves away from potential sources of contamination. It's really terrifying, because one of the things people often said about Germany was that, you know, it was a very civilized country, and yet it descended into barbarity. But conscientiousness is a very good predictor of long-term
Oh my
success.
God, oh.
And so you could say, well, conscientious societies are more civilized, but they're also more orderly, and that makes them more disgust sensitive. And so what it might have easily been in Germany was that it was an excess of civilization rather than its lack that produced exactly these consequences. And that's a far more frightening proposition, and one that's, I believe, much more likely to be true. Hitler bathed 4 times a day. And he was also an admirer of willpower, so he could stand like this for 8 hours in the back of a car. And the thing about conscientious people is they're very willpower oriented. And so if you're unfortunate enough to be sick chronically in the house of someone who's conscientious, especially if it's a mental illness, you're more likely to relapse, because the conscientious person is going to be judgmental, and they're going to say to you, they're going to say, well, if you just organize yourself and get up in the morning and try a little harder, you can overcome this, which is of course true, except you can't, because you're schizophrenic. And so the pressure put on you by the anger and the contempt is going to increase the probability that you'll relapse. So orderly people are very judgmental.
Okay.
And you know, orderliness is very highly
roll-up
associated
pants,
with things like
zookeeper
anorexia.
pants.
And the anorexic is basically someone who's so disgust sensitive that they become unable to tolerate their own
plus 5.
body. And they see it as a source of corruption and imperfection, which
And I
of
think
course
we're
is
gonna be
exactly
finished
right.
with the pants.
It is. And it's a very difficult thing to
Whatever
maintain
the fuck
order
happened now.
around. So anyways, so what happens out here in this terrible domain where Scar rules is that things turn into a totalitarian state. You know, and he's
Later,
presented
I can
here
maybe
as
buy
a
from the-
Nazi-like
from the
leader. And see, there's another
exchange
thing
if
that's
I
really
can-
interesting, that's
if I
even
cannot
deeper than
find
this
them
from a
two-
mythological
2 more
perspective.
turns.
I don't know if I can even go into it. Well, not really. I guess what I'll have to do is satisfy
it.
myself with this observation. There's always been some antagonism, for example, between the Catholic Church and rationalism.
Yes, please.
And everyone knows that. It's a very long-standing antagonism that sort of runs its way through at least the last 1,000 years or so of Western civilization. And
Let's go.
the people who
chest.
regarded Catholics as antithetical to science take the Catholics to task for that, and describing it as prejudicial and superstitious, and fair enough. But there's something else going on there that's more important, and that's the observation, and this is at a deep level again, the observation that
Okay.
rationality has one big
Missing,
problem.
Missing.
So it can easily become arrogant and believe in its own theories.
Missing.
So if you're smart, and there are going to be some of you people who are like that too, some of you, the primary trait that distinguished you from other people over the course of your whole life was that you were more intelligent than most, and you may have staked your identity on that,
So
and overvalue
layered
intelligence and
t-shirts.
rationality. And the problem with that is that you make a theory of the world, and then you tend to assume that it's 100% correct. That's the tendency to fall in love with your own theories, and that's what a totalitarian does. The totalitarian says, here's the damn theory, and it's exactly right, and you're going to act it out exactly. And if you don't, well, we've got some
Let's
special
find the
treats in mind
all-star
for you.
hoodie.
And one of the most terrible things that I encountered while reading about
they're going
totalitarianism,
well,
and this was even more true
not
of the
this
Soviet
one
Union
doesn't
under
have-
Stalin, was that the true believers,
two-toned
and there were
hooded
many of
jacket,
them,
glossy windbreaker jacket.
were in a terrible position because according to their own doctrine, they're already involved in the
Plus
process
three.
that was going to bring utopia to mankind. The problems had already been solved, but many of them were still suffering terribly as individuals. But if you're a totalitarian believer in utopia, your own suffering becomes heretical,
Let's go.
right? Because
Number
your
three,
suffering
plus
is an
three.
indication that
So
the
we
damn
can- I can
theory
do it
isn't
like that.
correct. So then
Right
you're in
away
a
it
terrible
was fine.
position because you either admit that the theory isn't correct and
But
fall
no.
apart because of that, and maybe face
You better
terrible
do-
punishment as
do
well,
more. Plus
or you
three.
have to separate yourself from your own suffering and lie about it fundamentally. And of course that's exactly what happened in places
I
like
don't
the
have
Soviet
this
Union,
one.
where everyone lied about everything
So,
all
around
of the
lots of
time,
your
to
t-shirts,
themselves, to
cotton
their
raglan
family members,
t-shirts.
to their friends. The entire system was completely permeated by
Plus three.
lies.
Number
So you
plus
get
three.
this terrible place that scars the ruler over, which is totalitarian and brutal
Going
and murderous and
600.
resentful and deceitful and arrogant all at the same time. And that's brought about. So the Columbine guys, for example, when they're justifying their murderousness and their plans to shoot
so-
up the schools, they keep making reference to the fact that
round
people had
long
slighted
fluted
them, for
t-shirts,
example,
cross-quilted
and
vests,
insulted them, and they
training
were
hooded
alienated.
vests.
They weren't bullied exactly the way the press made it out. I don't know if they were bullied any more than people usually are in high school, but they took their alienation personally and regarded that, their isolation from common humanity, as indication of the pathology of everything.
Training
And then they
hooded
went out
vests.
to destroy.
No.
And that's exactly what this
No.
sort of thing represents. That's the uniformity. And you see, he's got this kind of vicious grin on his face, which is malicious and pleased all at the same time. There's no fear in that. It's quite the opposite. And there's another image of, using what's essentially imagery of hell,
he's
which
farting.
everyone understands, strangely enough. And that associates him with the crescent moon. And the crescent moon is, well, it's a symbol of darkness and the underworld fundamentally. So,
Okay, what is this?
all right, so anyway, so
Cold
that's,
roasted
we see the
jacket
underworld, we
plus
see that which
6.
lies beyond the light, and in there we see a fragment of that that's basically
Okay,
hellish.
I
And
have
all
it.
of that's incorporated
Let's-
into the story. And everyone
no.
understands that when they see it.
Let's go see if
Even
it's anything
without, I
plus
would say,
3
the overt
plus
references to
5.
Nazism. Okay, so now Scar has a plan. He's going to kill the king,
Plus 5.
and he's going to do that by putting what the king loves in danger.
Okay,
And so
motherfucker.
Scar, feigning sympathy,
Plus
has
5.
enticed Simba down into this ravine, and Scar's minions are going to cause a wildebeest stampede, right? So a mindless stampede to put Simba in danger, and
This is
so that's what happens here.
motherfucking-
The wildebeest start to march into the ravine, and everyone is making a.
Okay,
Scar
no,
tells Mufasa
only
that
one
Simba
time.
is down in that ravine, and entices him down there, and so they're all off running to see if they can save
cotton
Simba.
suit jacket, I don't
Yeah.
have it.
Then you see
classic
Mufasa
shirt.
running in front of the wildebeest
Better
herd, trying to
jacket, shirts,
find his son and
aristocrat
trying to
t-shirt.
stay ahead of them, the mad mob that's put his son in danger. And so he tries to escape, climbing up the butte, which is almost a sheer cliff. And when he gets to the top, his brother is waiting for him there, and he asks him to pull him up. and Scar basically, before he kills him, indicates that he's betraying him and puts his claws into Mufasa's paws and throws him off the cliff. And so that's that, and it's a sad part of the story. It's a hard part that's very hard on kids because the father has died, and it's a rare kid who won't cry about that scene in particular, where you see Simba very upset at his father dying. Now, this is a hard part of the story to interpret, and I don't know if it's because of my lack of ability to interpret or because the story takes a weird twist here, but there is this confusion in the story about whether Simba's an innocent victim who's set up for the murder of his father, or whether he actually bears some guilt for it. You know, and he's broken some rules and so on. So he's not exactly placed in the position of innocence, but of course he's also been set up by Scar. In any case, Scar tells him that it's his fault, pure and pure, and that because of that he's going to have to leave. He's going to have to be banished beyond the kingdom. Now, you see this motif quite frequently in hero stories, where the hero has to be raised outside of the kingdom. That happens with King Arthur, for example. And it happens with Harry Potter, right? Because Harry Potter is raised by muggles instead of being inside the magic kingdom. So it's a very common theme, and partly what it means is that it means two things. One is that you do grow up alienated from your culture to some degree. There's no way around that, because the culture doesn't match you perfectly, and it doesn't work for you perfectly, and it's old and it's kind of corrupt, and it alienates you as it's shaping you, and so you're going to develop some separation from it. And you see that in intergenerational rhetoric, you know, where the new generation has the proclivity to blame the previous generation for everything that's wrong with the current system. And fair enough, you know, because you do inherit everything that's wrong. Of course, you also inherit everything that's going well, which is a good thing to also notice. But the idea is that you can't help but be alienated from, let's call it the patriarchy, for lack of a better word, because it's got a tyrannical element, and because it's not matched well to you. So, but then there's also this other issue, which is, well, maybe you're not being successful by the terms that are, by the values that are instantiated in the current system. And you might say, well, that's because the system is set up in an unfair manner, and fair enough. But it's also possibly because you're just not very good at acting out those values. Right? So part of the reason you get alienated from your culture is because the culture is corrupt. But another part of the reason is you're just not doing as well as you could be. You're not playing by even your own rules properly. And so you get alienated and you're unsuccessful because of your own inadequacies. And so the movie plays both of those. It's obviously Simba is set up, but there is an intimation that he's not entirely blameless as well. Anyways, he's very broken up about this, and no wonder. It's also partly a story of the emergence of adolescence, because, you know, when you're a child and you're ensconced right inside the familial framework, then you sort of exist within that system of rules, like you would under the Piagetian scheme. But when you become an adolescent, then there's much more of a proclivity to break free and to start breaking rules. And so that's also akin in some sense to the death of the father. And that's a necessary developmental stage. Anyway, Scar comes down into the ravine. It's all foggy now, because that goes along with the sort of murkiness of death, and tells Simba that it's his fault, and that he's going to have to leave. He's going to have to leave the kingdom of his father, which makes sense now. His father's dead, so how are you going to, once your father has died, how are you going to stay around in his kingdom, so to speak?
Damn me.
So, and then Scar tries to get these hyenas to go track Simba down and kill him. So,
what is with this?
and Zazu goes back to tell all the rest of the lions that Mufasa is dead and that Simba has disappeared. And then Scar
what is with weapon, by level, by grade?
Pride Rock. And so what's happened now is the malevolent element of the king has obtained control over the state.
Let's go.
Right? And so
first manual weapons. I don't need them.
The wise king wasn't paying enough attention. That's one way of looking at it.
Shotgun?
And so the malevolent part of the state has now got control. This is a very, very old idea. I've traced it back at least several thousand years in its representation in stories. You can see it in Egyptian mythology, for example. So the idea is that as the social structure builds in complexity, it offers you the protection of
What
a
the
functioning
hell?
complex system, but it also becomes
Assault.
increasingly likely to turn into a tyranny. And because it's more and more powerful, the
peace.
fact of its potential for tyranny becomes more and more of a danger. And so then the question is,
MPV,
well,
micro.
what are the factors that encourages it turning into a tyranny? And one factor would be the wise part of it is not paying enough attention to the
Shotgun,
malevolent part of
pistol.
it. And you could say that's true at the state level, and it's also
Assault
true at the
rifles.
individual level, right? You
Assault
have to watch your
rifles.
own proclivity to upset yourself and other people,
Okay,
and,
let's go.
and take that into account and pay careful attention to it, because
See,
otherwise it can gain
SMGs,
control,
what do we need
especially
to
because you're going to
update?
avoid looking at it. And one of the characteristics of the wise king who gets overthrown by the tyrant is that he has an evil brother and he won't pay enough attention to him. He avoids, he doesn't look. And so the evil king gets the upper hand, and that's what's happened here. And so notice now he takes possession of Pride Rock, not
What
in
the fuck?
full daylight, right? But at night. So that ties his rule into the rule of unconscious processes and
Hector
malevolence.
and Tommy plus
All right,
5.
so Simba
Do I have a
runs away
Hector?
from the kingdom out into the desert. Now, why is that? Well, you remember, and maybe you don't know it, the story of Exodus, when Moses takes the Hebrews out of Egypt. They end up in a desert. Well,
Plus 5.
why? Well, it's because when you leave a kingdom, no matter how tyrannical,
Plus 5.
you still fall into disorder.
Plus
You're
3.
out in a place that's
Plus
desert.
3,
There's no
plus 5.
civilization there. No, that's what happened to
Hector is
Iraq
missing.
after the Americans went in. You know, the Americans, the neocons, were all convinced that the Iraqis
I'm
would
missing.
welcome them with open arms and there would be this smooth transition to democracy. Same idea in Libya. It's like, no, that's not what happens. What happens is the state devolves into a desert chaos. And maybe then you can make order, but
Oh my
probably
God, where is
not.
the
And
plus
so
5?
Simba has left the kingdom, and the first thing that
okay.
happens is he damn near dies in the desert.
Okay,
And
plus
so,
5,
you know,
plus 5, plus 5.
If you have an old belief system and it's not working very well and you abandon it, well, good for you, because you're out of the old belief system, but now you're nowhere. One of the things that happens to alcoholics, for example, and
Plus
other
5.
drug
Let's go
addicts
plus
as well. So imagine that
Micro 9, plus 5.
you're trying to stop drinking. All right, fine. Maybe you have to undergo some medical treatment so when you first stop, you don't die of seizures, because that often happens to people who are addicted to alcohol. So, and they get Valium or something like that from a doctor to see them through the
Oh my
first
God,
bits
no,
of,
no, no.
what do you call it? Of sobering up. And so they get through it, and then maybe 2 weeks later, they're not physiologically dependent on alcohol anymore. The same thing is true with cocaine. But if you take them back and you put
please.
them in their environment, say they go back out of the treatment center, back into the normal world, they start drinking or using right away again. And the reason for that is that,
Okay.
well, let's say you've been an alcoholic for 20 years.
MPVK,
Okay. First of all,
micro 9.
that's all you do for entertainment. You drink. And all your friends are alcoholics, right? And so, if you're going to stop drinking, not only do you have to rid yourself of the physiological addiction, but you have to completely learn a new way of living. Because what do you know? You have to get rid of all your friends because they're all drunks, pretty much. Or if they're not, they're at least people who are facilitating the drinking. So you have to build a whole new social network. You don't know how to amuse yourself because, of course, the way you've done that is by going to the bar, sitting at home drinking. And so there's a huge hole in your life. You abandon the previous pathological mode of adaptation. But that just leaves you with nothing. And then you have to rebuild that thing from scratch.
God, now
It's
I need to
extraordinarily
find the
difficult,
assault
and that's
rifle.
why so many people fail when they're trying to overcome a major addiction.
After this assault
So-
rifle, everything else is
All right, so anyways, Simba's out there in the desert. He's left his family and the comforts of home, and he's discovered by Pumbaa and who's the little rat's name? Timon? Yes, he's a meerkat, right? Which are very cool things. And they discover him, and this is sort of his transition into adolescence, and he kind of finds, and this is, I would say, more typical of the male transition into adolescence, because females, of course, hit puberty so much younger. The males who aren't very attractive when they're young, and just starting to undergo puberty, they're not very attractive to females. They tend to clump together in gangs and manage the transition over what it could be 7 years. So, and that's what happens here is
Okay.
Simba joins this little gang of, you know, these guys are all right, but, you know, they're a little on the primordial side, you might say. You know, one of them is basically just a walking gastrointestinal tract, and the other one is, he's not so bad, but he's like, you know, a foot high, really, what good is he? And so he's got some second-rate companions out here past the desert, but he's out of childhood now, and now he enters the adolescent world. And what happens here is that very quickly in the film, he goes from being a little cub to a full adolescence, and there's about a 5-minute transition, and so it's the next stage in his development. And now he's out there in this paradise, which is kind of strange because adolescence really is no picnic. But the idea here is that he really doesn't have any responsibilities, right? None. And that is one thing about adolescence is, and even the stage of life that you guys are at, is you have lots to do, but you're not really responsible for anyone other than yourself. And so even though you might be quite burdened with your current responsibilities, it's nothing compared to what it will be like when you have responsibility for children, for example, or for the people that are working for you, or whatever. So anyways, out here, it's a kind of impulsive place as well, and adolescence is like that. We've had high school students try to do the future authoring program, you know, where they have to think 3 to 5 years down the road. It's like, forget that. They just can't do it, and I've watched them, and what happens is you immediately become aware of just how little high school students know when they're like 15 or 16. 3 to 5 years? Forget it. They don't have the world knowledge to project themselves out that far in the future, not even close. And so we've built a high school version that helps them design a better future 3 to 6 months down the road, and even that's really pushing it. But you know, adolescents are more impulsive and they live more for the moment, and
what the fuck? Okay,
there's some
60
utility in
minutes
that.
gap.
I mean, being impulsive and
I
living
think
for the
I'm
moment
gonna
is one
go a
of the
little
things
bit
that gets you
more,
pregnant as a
finish
teenager, and
assault
that is certainly
rifles,
one way that the species has managed to
shotgun,
propagate itself.
Pistol,
And
blunt,
so,
blunt.
positive emotion and impulsivity are very tightly linked. And so
First
he's out there in
shot.
this
Accuracy,
adolescent
sniper rifle,
delusional
blades,
fantasy. That might be one way of thinking about it, but more importantly, he's out there
collection,
where
reload speed.
he's in a domain now where the impulses of the moment
M16,
basically take
A2
precedence.
+5 and
And so-
4 A1 +5.
And I think they sing some song about
this is snipers.
yeah, Hakuna Matata, right, which basically means do whatever you want, and tomorrow will take care of
16,
itself,
A2
or something like
+5.
that. So it's very
Let's
impulsive,
go +5.
lacks all responsibility.
Reload time is very
One
nice.
of the things that I would recommend to you
I
if you want to
left
protect
this
yourself
time.
from
I did not do it last
ideological
time.
possession, shall we say,
Let's
is
see
that
if
when you
enough
hear
of
people
yes.
speak politically and they don't say anything about your responsibilities, you should
Let's
probably
go
stop
5-5.
listening to them.
No,
Because
don't do
Whenever they're
this.
trying to offer you something, it doesn't come along with an equivalent cost. There's something being hidden from you. And they're appealing to the part of you that's, well, I would say, at best, adolescent. So, all right, so anyways, he's out there in his little adolescent paradise, and with his dopey chums, and back at Pride
M4
Rock,
A1
things are
+5.
not good, right? Scar, who's arrogant and refuses to learn, and who will not establish a reasonable relationship with females, all he does is tyrannize over them. He ends up ruling over a completely barren landscape. And that's really what happens in totalitarian states. And we also know, quite interestingly,
Yes, please,
is
a
that
little bit faster
one of the best
reload.
predictors of economic development in a state is the degree to which they extend rights to women. It's one of the best predictors. And I would say, well, if you're going to tyrannize your own women, you're going to tyrannize everything. You're going to tyrannize ideas. You're going to tyrannize structures.
please.
Like, if you have to enslave your own women, you've adapted a pretty damn pathological view of the world, and the probability that that narrow, constrained, restricted viewpoint is going to pay off for you economically is extraordinarily
Assault
low.
rifle.
So anyways, Scar, it's like what happened in the Soviet
S550.
Union. You know, part of the reason it collapsed by 1989 is that it just could not move any farther. It was like this really complicated
S555.
motor that was worn completely out, that no one had ever taken care of,
Let's go.
and it just ground to a halt. It just stopped working because it didn't work. And so if you're totalitarian and you won't update your system and adjust it, then it wears out and grinds to a halt, and everything becomes unproductive.
Oh,
No.
yes.
It's not easy to figure out what makes a society productive. Because you
Oh,
might
yes,
say,
yes.
well, it's natural resources or something like that. First of all, natural resources are very often a curse
So
to a
assault
country
rifle attack power
because they produce
+3.
corruption. They call that the Dutch disease. There's a reason for that. You can look
And
it
I
up.
need,
But
far
natural
H.
resources in and of themselves are by no means sufficient to guarantee the well-being of a country. Japan has virtually no natural resources at all, and it's really rich.
Let's
And
go.
one of the
5.
prime natural resources actually seems, maybe there's two. One is honesty, another is trust. And if you can set up a society where people are roughly honest, which means they do what they say they're going to do, and where the default bargaining position on both sides is trust, then the probability that that culture will become wealthy is very, very high. So, and a functional legal system is also a natural resource of tremendous, tremendous value. You know, it's partly why people in China, for example, wealthy people in China are dumping their money into the real estate market in North America like mad, because one of the things you do know if you buy real estate in North America is you actually own it. It's still going to be yours 20 years in the future, or 30 years in the future. There's no doubt about
right,
that.
first
And so
shot,
that
sniper
fact of
rifle
ownership
blade
is
attack.
embedded in the functioning legal system. And that's what gives those sorts of properties
Crafting grade
crazy
successful
value.
ability.
You know, much to the problematic situation for all of you people who are,
Okay, attack powers
at
are
some
normal.
point, most
Zombie,
of you are going to
blade
try to buy
attack,
property in
tactical,
Toronto, and that's
portal,
really going to be
zombies.
entertaining. So now look,
Yeah,
the
this
other
is
thing
it.
about
This is the
Scars, he's
one.
got the little bird
This is done.
locked up, right? That's the vision of the king. Well, he doesn't want to know anything. He already knows everything. So why does he need this stupid bird flying around telling him what's going on? The last thing he
Alrighty.
wants to know is what's going on.
Achievement, 54
Yeah.
days.
Stalin, I
Successful
mean,
escape.
God, he gave that
77.
guy bad news or good news.
Modify,
He was going to have you
repair,
killed.
600,000
He kept the bad news to a
meters.
minimum.
Thus,
And that's a real
no, I did
problem,
not
right?
have a
Because
chance.
if you torture people who bring you
10,000,
bad news, then
7,000.
you're never going to learn anything. Well, you don't have to if you already know everything anyways.
Direct,
And so that's the situation
soon. This
here.
is for the next time. Vagabonds.
Well, his little minions,
slowly.
the hyenas, are getting pretty unhappy
Try
because
to
they
clear
haven't had
this
anything to eat. And
20,
the reason for that is they've just stripped the
70K,
landscape
70K.
bare, right? I mean, and I read
And
at
it
the
was
demise of the Soviet Union that something like 10 to
live.
15% of the entire landmass of the
Max
Soviet
level
Union had been
777,
rendered permanently
no.
uninhabitable by industrial pollution. So, you know, and then that, I don't remember if that included
45
Chernobyl,
combat
you know, where that
achievements,
terrible nuclear
45,
accident
50
took place,
life
but
achievements,
there were
30 or 50.
massive domains of
Bullshit.
devastation in those
This
countries
is
that
also bugged.
will take hundreds
This
of
is
years
also
to fix.
bugged.
So,
Fuck me.
anyways, when
Okay,
Scar
guys,
rules,
thank
everyone
you very much
starves.
for
That's a good
watching.
way of
See you
thinking
in
about it,
next
or everyone
video.
dies.
Now
But that's
I'm going
okay, because
to
that's really
farm
what he's
some
after
bullshit.
anyway. So that works out quite nicely. Now back out here.